This is My Taste is Better Than Yours, the manga podcast where Guardian Enzo and I, Samu, discuss some of our favourite series and figure out, is my taste better than yours? Hello there, everyone. It's Samu here hosting this time. I'm joined, as always, by my lovely co host, Enzo. And similar to what we did last time with Rurouni Kenshin, I have a series here that I've recommended. Another one which is a Weekly Shonen Jump battle title that was not part of his resume of what he'd experienced. And in the same way that he was recommending Rurouni Kenshin to me to experience one of his favorite titles, I'm doing the same with Bleach. It's finally happening. I'm finally getting to talk about Bleach, Enzo. How are we feeling? How are you doing?
Congratulations. I know this has been a long time coming. I'm fine, thank you. And turnabout is fair play. So you dabbled a toe into the waters that are Rurouni Kenshin, so only fair that I do the same for a series you hold in similarly high regard in Bleach.
You touched on it when you mentioned Rurouni Kenshin that was a series that probably came at quite a pivotal time in your anime manga journey, your experience in kicking off. You said it was the first one that you watched and read both of. Um,
Yes.
and I have a similar story with Bleach, so probably age me, but I was 14 years old when I heard about Bleach, and at the time it was running. It was during the Iran Car arc, and um, obviously growing up, I'd had anime that was just on TV that I'd experienced: Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, Beyblade, Digimon, things that were just there that I didn't necessarily know were anime, but I really loved. Death Note was the first series, the first anime that I watched in dub, mind you. When I was around 13 or 14, I was like, oh, okay, this could be something. And then I can still remember I was in French class in high school and I turned around and one of my friends from high school, she was like, oh, you like Death Note, you should try Bleach. And the funny story is she didn't, she had only like watched one episode. Um, and basically, what happened was I went home and I think I watched like 11 episodes before I went to bed. Went to school the next day, came back and watched like 20 episodes. And then I kept going and going and going. And anyone who's familiar with the Bounce arc of Bleach will know that's a very extensive filler arc, which is not good at all. I actually dropped it around that time, not knowing the difference between canon and filler in anime. So it took me about 6 months, and then yeah, once I caught up with the anime, jumped into the manga, and I made so many errors. I was such a noob back then, where I got to where the latest anime episode, and then I just jumped on the latest manga chapter, which was something like 80 chapters ahead of where there was like an 80 chapter gap. So I was like, I have no idea what's happening, but I love this. So it's one of the definitive anime manga experiences for me. I read it from that point onwards until it completed, and even when it ended, I don't think it's up on Random C anymore, but I did this massive, like 10K word post on Bleach as a whole, and yeah, it had a bad reputation, I think, when it ended. But I was resolute. I stood firm in how much I loved the series and what I loved about it. And the ironic thing is, almost 10 years later, we have the anime which is back, and it seems like the fan base has shifted. The approach to the series is even the people who I know were critical of the series back then have changed their tune, and I'll accept it. I will. They won't. They don't apologize for their wrongdoing, but I will accept it because I always saw what the spirit of Bleach and what I love so much about it, and the fact that it is having this resurgence at the moment. Yeah, I can be happier. It's a great time to be a Bleach fan. So, what better time to get Enzo to read Bleach as well to experience it? Some like key details in about Bleach. So it did start in 2001, and like we did with Rurouni Kenshin, we're only going to do the first arc here, similar to Hunter x Hunter style. So we're only going to talk about the Agent of the Shinigami arc, otherwise known as the Substitute Shinigami arc, and that ran until 2003. So it was around 2 years of publication. And yes, it's done by Tite Kubo. He had one title before this, Zombie Powder, which I believe that started maybe in the same batch or just after the batch as Naruto, and then obviously that got cancelled, and then a few years later we got Bleach, and then the big three became what the big three is. Yeah, very brief synopsis for anyone who doesn't know, but just to cover the basics. Ichigo Kurosaki, 15-year-old Ichigo. He's a teenager and he has the ability to see spirits and be in touch with these people that are just navigating the world that no one else can see. In comes Rukia Kuchiki. She's a Shinigami from the afterlife, from the Soul Society. And her role as a Shinigami is to bring these spirits using her console from the human world to the other side. But things go wrong when a hollow attacks Rukia. Hollow, which is these spirits of those who have passed but who have been unable to move on to the afterlife, have been tainted in some way. This attacks Rukia. She loses her chance to defeat it, and she gives Ichigo her powers temporarily to defeat that hollow. But as a result of that happening, something goes wrong, and Rukia basically loses her abilities. She's stuck in this body as a human body for the time being. She can't go back to the Soul Society, so Ichigo has to be the substitute Shinigami in her place for Karakurata, where they live. So, yes, for this arc, it's about him taking on that mantle, guiding souls to the afterlife, fighting hollows, and introducing the cast. Okay, let's start broad then. Enzo, your experience with the big three. I'm finally getting you to get into one of the big three. Very briefly, I'm just curious on your knowledge and just experience and vague thoughts on the big three and Bleach specifically. If you have how you differentiate them in your mind, and if you have ever thought you were going to try one, was this maybe the one that you thought would be the first?
Well, I will say that I have, at the very least, in terms of a chapter or two or an episode or two of the anime adaptations, I have tried all of the big three at some point or another. All of them quite a long time ago now, and nothing really took for me with any of them. To be honest with you, once we got past that, it's been so many years since I read any of Bleach or Naruto. One Piece, I always kind of had a more detailed knowledge of what that was, just because of how eponymous it is in Japanese culture. I mean, it's everywhere, so you can't help but know something about One Piece, even if you don't read it, even if you don't watch the anime. And I tried. With Bleach and Naruto, I had a vague sense of what was different between the two of them. I knew that Naruto was a little more popular. I knew that they had fan bases that liked to bitch about them a lot, especially Bleach. I knew Bleach was infamous for a filler arc in the anime. I did know that. But above and beyond that, I did not know a hell of a lot, really. So I went into this about as close to cold turkey as you can go into a series that's been as popular both domestically and internationally as Bleach has. So I guess that's my answer to that question.
Okay. I will say that for all the big three, the first arc that they have is about finding the identity, finding their footing, and they do evolve from there. It is funny, if I was to consider them, I would actually say Naruto has the best first arc of them. Um, but then Naruto then becomes pretty easily my third place of the three. I love One Piece as well, but it is very, very different from Bleach in terms of presentation and just how the story is structured. I think what Bleach has, which is different from the two of them, and some people use it as a detriment to the main characters, Ichigo, is Ichigo as a main character, and he doesn't have this tangible obvious title or goal that he wants. He doesn't want to be the Pirate King. He doesn't want to be the Hokage. And I think that I've seen that over the years being a very surface level critique on, well, he's a reactive character. He doesn't really want to do anything. There's nothing there much beyond him. I've always disliked that way of thinking. I think, funnily, that we talked about Rurouni Kenshin, because I feel like there are some similarities in Kenshin to Ichigo, where his motivations for doing what he does is very, very personal, and they're not
Hmm.
it's not this identity or this title that he wants that can so easily be shown in like a double spread of the final chapter. Like, there we go, he's reached the final goal. It's just this way of living with himself and improving himself as a person, based on what happened in the past. And yeah, I love Ichigo. I think Ichigo is my favorite of the three main characters as well, shockingly. So Ichigo feels like his problems and his struggles, I think, for me, resonate on a way that's quite different than, say, Luffy or Naruto. So yeah, I'm curious in just your take on Ichigo Kurosaki as a character. How are you feeling about him from this arc, from experiencing him?
I do think it occurred to me as well, given the context in which we were covering these two series, that there are similarities between Ichigo and Kenshin, because Gon wants to meet his father. He wants to become a hunter. Luffy wants to be the pirate king. All these things you're talking about. Yes, there is no defining single goal in Ichigo's life. Kenshin is more or less, his goal is to live day to day and to atone in whatever small ways he can for the things he's done in the past. I think there's a pretty significant difference in the level of actual culpability in their past, between Kenshin and Ichigo, and I think that's natural to an extent that Ichigo was so young. He looks much older than 15, by the way, in my opinion, but he is 15 at the beginning of the series. And as such, his worldview, I think, is somewhat simplistic and somewhat limited by the scope of his own perception of how big the world is. Now, over the course of this first arc, which runs about, well, in fact, exactly 70 chapters, he does have, by hook or by crook, he has no choice. His view of the world expands because he realizes that there is much more of the world than he was aware of before. But in a funny way, psychologically, I feel like his view of the world is still very constricted, even by the close of this arc. He's still very much caught in the box of being a 15-year-old with a 15-year-old's view of reality. Even in spite of all the things he's seen, I still think to a certain extent I see that as a challenge for him going forward, which is not a criticism. I think that's entirely realistic. So that's kind of my take on Ichigo, and I like Ichigo. He doesn't wow me, but I think he's I think he's a pretty interesting main character.
Yeah, I feel like his limited worldview and experience is so much about how he is integral to him and how he navigates the story here and going forward. Because I'll mention this when we go into the more spoiler section, but he puts so much weight on his own regret that, from our perspective, we can be like, you don't have to do that. It's not your fault. You don't need to carry the burden. But he is someone who carries burden for others, and his goal is to protect his friends and loved ones and not see suffering. This is a series, like I said, I read and watched it when I was a teen. If I was to count the amount of times I've reread the series by way of either just on my own accord or watching reactions or live streams or people on Twitch who are experiencing the series for the first time, I don't know. There are segments of the series I've probably read about 20, 25 times. So
Wow.
this series has it's lodged in my brain space where there are people who are even better at it than me, but I can almost identify what's happening by a given chapter. Like, if you were to like throw me somewhere, I could tell you what was everything that's going around there. I know every character's name, every position, and all these minor details that for so many other series kind of just wash over me. Even getting to re-experience Bleach more as I've gotten older and seeing Ichigo, I think, beside the fact that he's just a really like cool badass main character, I think there is depth to him as well that I really really appreciate. One of the reasons people cite is that they enjoy Bleach is the cool factor that it just has. The sense of cool that it has is just like immense, and it carries through in the fights and the action and the characters. And I agree with that. I think that is the initial thing that sold me as a teen, and I think is probably what hooked a lot of people when it became popular, when it came out. Yeah, I think there is a real heart to the series, and although the main themes of the story aren't really apparent in this arc, I'm going to be it'll be interesting as we go arc by arc and how the series evolves from there. I think another part that people praise is Tite Kubo's artwork. I love it. He's one of my favorite artists in Weekly Shonen Jump. Just in general, I suppose, as well. He does change and progress as an artist quite heavily. This arc, I feel, I mean, I'm curious what you think, Enzo, but I feel like it's quite graphic. It feels of the times, it's very early noughties, whereas it does soften as time goes on. And yeah, I love Tite Kubo's artwork, both in the action and in the like subtle expressions he can put across here. Yeah, did the art speak to you at all in any way, Enzo?
It's interesting. It struck me that in a lot of ways, I think his art is somewhat Spartan. I don't, my perception of in looking, as I was reading through this, is not, when we talked about the other, like even in the most recent episode when we talked about Matsui and Watsuki and their kind of impact pages. I feel like what he goes for is a lot. What Tite Kubo goes for is more simple and elegant. And you will see a lot of blank spaces in his pages. If it's funny to say, but I almost think of like a Tim Burton style a little bit when I look at some of the non-human characters, for example, that eventually get introduced into the story and the facial expressions. It almost has kind of that Nightmare Before Christmas kind of a look to it to me, which may be completely out of left field, but I feel like I feel like it's very antithetical to Kenshin in art style, but neither better or worse, just different. In it is you definitely get a more of a flowy feel from panel to panel and page to page, and I don't see like these tremendous. Occasionally, he'll give you this really poppy one scene, one panel, one page where you get a lot of like really intricate detail, but mostly I feel like his art style is almost simple in a way. That's my perception of it. That's my perception of it.
No, I mean that's not far off what people say. One of them, a lot of people do praise the artwork, but anyone who does not enjoy it, they often say the lack of backgrounds is a reason why they don't like it. Personally, I feel like the backgrounds of a series, any series, does not make a series. Um, and Tite Kubo has gone on record when people have talked about this. He's saying his focus in these panels, in these scenes where there is white space, is that he wants the characters and their expressions and what they're feeling to be the focus. So
Right.
yeah, I've never felt it being a negative. Some people I feel like view this idea of, oh, if you're not doing a berserk level background on every double spread, then you're not a true artist. I just don't think that's true. I think everyone has their own style, and Kubo is very efficient, both I would say in his storytelling and in his artwork. And I think people who critique some of the critiques I see of that, I think don't really give credit to just that approach to telling a story. It's not One Piece, Oda crams his pages with panels and these big double spreads, but even within those spreads, you see extra panels and all these different cuts to everyone else, and it's a lot. It can sometimes be, and I love One Piece, but it can sometimes be an assault on the senses to see everything that he's throwing at you to get as much content as possible. And Kubo is not afraid to make his chapters a bit more breezy, just for the experience of the flow, the panel to panel, and like the moment. Which I think also affects maybe some people's enjoyment, especially if you read it week to week. Yeah, sometimes you can read a chapter and you'll be like, "Oh, that took 2 minutes to get through these 19 pages." But I don't think that's necessarily a negative, and I'm sure you probably didn't feel the impact of
No,
that. And when you,
I don't think it's a negative. It's just it's that's his style, and I think you never really struggle to understand where you're supposed to be looking when you
oh
read a
yes,
page of Bleach. You always know okay, this is where he wants me to. This is where he wants my attention, and that's not always true with the Elusive Samurai or Rurouni Kenshin or Vagabond or some other series where you have authors who really are more about a big composite. And I think, as you said, efficient is one word that I definitely think would fit. He's directing your attention where on what's important in the moment, and not spending too much time stressing over the rest of it. I think that's probably a fair statement.
okay, yeah, I'm glad you said that. I feel that's definitely true. It's everything feels intentional. It feels like you're with a confident artist who knows what they're doing. Yeah, yeah, I feel that definitely. On a side tangent, I will say I think there are some series that also have these chapter title pages. One Piece kind of does it, but through the method of these like side stories at the start of every chapter. And I think with Kubo, he does get the chance to show off his like creative compositions and all these chapter titles he does through every chapter of the series, and where he chooses to drop the title as well is also very cool. And fun fact, apart from a few, I would probably count with one or two hands, he does them all in English too. So yeah, there's some very bold, sometimes weird choices of chapter titles, but I love how he utilizes that.
It's funny. I'm scanning through a couple of chapters now as we're talking, and I'm having a strange thought in my head, which is that this anime would have been very interesting in black and white.
Oh,
And I don't know what that.
I'm so glad you said that. Oh, sorry. Finish your thought. Finish your thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that says about his either the storytelling or as an artist, but as I look at these panels now in light of this conversation, it just strikes me. I know the anime is in color, but it would be very interesting to see this animated in black and white because it has that kind of a style of like a pre-color of a pre-color comic book in a way. It almost feels like there's something elemental about it that would work very well in black and white visual format. Which, since you're drawing a
I'm,
manga, is maybe a good thing.
I'm so glad you said that because okay, so one of the ways I've re-experienced this series recently is through AJ Alexander, spelled ALEC. And he's gone through Bleach and he saw a lot of things in it that resonate with me and also opened my eyes to it as well. And one thing that he's touched on, which I agree with, is this idea of black and white. It's a bit different for me. I experienced anime first, but he said something similar where because it was a manga for him, he almost couldn't imagine what the series was like in color. It seems like it's just meant to be a manga. Um, and
Hmm.
as I've been going over that, I'm like, yeah, I see that because the anime is quite different. It has to take some liberties, but the impact of the black and white, I think that is, I think Kubo is great at that. It's one of his strengths. Similar to we mentioned it in the previous episode, Chainsaw Man. That is another one where it has great flow. I think Fujimoto is maybe one of the best at nailing the page turn. I think Kubo has a similar approach to that as well. Just how he's able to use the black ink to his strength. So yeah, I'm glad that you said that as well. I definitely feel that. One other thing as well, I did mention to Enzo when he started reading was to check out the poems as well because um, there are poems at the start of every volume. For Bleach, each volume has just one character who is focused, and the poem is either from their perspective or about them. Sometimes they add on to what we already see of them, and I think sometimes they kind of hint for things. And I think it's a nice way for Kubo to just show off another element of his creativity, and maybe not including these things within the series, but as a little supplement to their journey. And I think if I was to highlight any from this arc, if I was to highlight any from this arc, it would be Orihime's. I'll read it verbatim. Hers is, "If I were the rain that joins sky and earth that otherwise never touch, could I join two hearts as well?" Now, the reason why I really like that is probably a good segue into the spoiler discussion. So anyone's not familiar, this is going to be going into specifics, but I love Orihime, and I think that this specific line, this specific poem that we've got here, relates to obviously her feelings that she has for Ichigo, but it ties to this idea of connecting the sky and the earth. People, I read it as people who are alive, people who are dead, who have passed on. She sees the sadness that Ichigo has in losing his mother, and rain is definitely a motif which is used throughout the series. It's used in particular in the sub arc with Grand Fisher, and it's used various times throughout. But this idea of the rain being the absolute worst, the immense sadness of a situation, and Orihime trying to be that sadness or to replace that sadness and connect people together. And yeah, I'll use that as a tangent to talk about Orihime. Orihime does have she gets introduced quite early on, and she's a character I really really love. She's one of my favorites in the entire series, and unfortunately, she's hated on quite a bit. She gets a lot of critiques, which I just don't think are valid. I think what we see her in this story arc, at least, it's quite tragic what we see with her and her brother, and I think that mirrors this like family loss that she sees in Ichigo as well. I just see a lot between both of them, which I feel a lot for them, and I just think she's such a sweetheart. And I'm curious, do you have any takes on Orihime and anything related to that little segment?
I like her. I didn't realize she was a hated character. I don't see anything off the top of my head that immediately jumps off the page and say, "Wow, I get why people don't like her," or whatever. I remember seeing one of the last chapters I read had the first popularity poll, and I think she came in third. So obviously, at least in Japan, there were some people that liked her.
Yeah.
But I had a couple characters that stood out more than others for me. I wouldn't say she was my favorite character, but I certainly didn't hate her. I found her to be interesting. I found her to be pretty likable. Her kind of sort of random, like really random. Well, she came in fifth in the first popularity poll. I'm just checking. Uryu Ishida came in third. What I liked about her was just kind of she was like in a different world than everybody else. Like she was, even before we got into this whole question of Soul Reapers and the alternate worlds and ghosts and all this, it felt like she was seeing a different world than everyone else was seeing, if you know what I mean. She had her own reality in a different sort of way. And I liked that. I found that interesting about her. So yeah, I liked her. I thought she was a good character. Is a good character, I should say.
A lot of the dislike for her maybe also comes from the anime adaptation. Maybe it's down to the voice actress.
I don't know anything about that.
So yeah, again, this is going to be
English or Japanese? English or Japanese voice actress?
Japanese. So if anyone's familiar, they will know that the anime likes to spam her usage of saying Kurosaki-kun. She says it quite a bit throughout the series because that's how she addresses him. She doesn't call him by his first name. She says it enough times in the anime that it like rings in people's ears, which is just unfortunate that is the thing that, among other people who critique how she's used later on, I have opinions on that, which I'll get to when we do cover that material. But yeah, I think she's just such a sweetheart. And like you say, I think you can tell she's coping. If anything, I think she's also the funniest character. Her little scenario that she imagines when she's like sprinting in that race and then someone like shoots her from behind because she's like imagining her being with Ichigo. Like the like thing she conjures up. I think she's really funny. She's really sweet, but you can tell that she's using it maybe as like a coping mechanism, which is similar to what Ichigo is doing with his mother. Yeah, I'll transition then into that section of the story, which is the June 17th and the Grand Fisher storyline. To me, this is when Bleach. This is when it really hooked me. The first instance where I was like, okay, there's something more than just it being really cool and fighting these hollows and Ichigo just being a badass. I think this exploration of his what basically happens is he blames himself for what happened to his mother when she died. He ran after a little girl in the river, and unbeknownst to him, it was a hollow who uses the little girl as his bait. And he killed his mother, Masaki, who ran after him to prevent him from drowning. So when we cut back to those flashbacks, we see that Ichigo was kind of like the soft little boy who cried a lot and had quite a different personality than he has now. So he's hardened himself in a way, and yeah, I think it's tragic and unfortunate, but he puts so much burden on himself. Like I said, this blame of what happened that he overcompensates in trying to be like he's trying to be the white knight in every situation. But him having this showdown with Grand Fisher, I think this is my favorite stretch of this arc in early Bleach. And what it made me think of is when we talked about shonen hits and kaiju, you talked about what are the things that make these kaiju, and we kind of came up with a couple ideas, like a character that like has that impact and pushes through the page and a bit of luck. But then you also said the quest or the redemption. Um, and I feel that in Kenshin, and I feel that in Ichigo here. This like idea that he has to continually redeem himself um, for what happened, and yeah, I think that all comes together really, really nicely in this. Yeah,
The
do
irony in
you
that, really, though, is that nobody else blames him for what happened. He's
exactly?
the only one who blames himself, and he shouldn't blame himself, frankly. So it's like, in contrast to Kenshin, who should blame himself for everything, and has a full. I mean, he owns up to things that he should be owning up to. Um, in context of Strawberry, he really, he frankly doesn't really have anything. And I don't think that cheapens or lessens his arc, really, because, like I say, when I talk about sort of his limited worldview as a 15-year-old, I think that has something to do with it. And I think it's reflected in the fact that he does hold himself responsible for this thing, which really isn't his fault. And so this is, in effect, his driving force in life is guilt. And that's an interesting angle for a character in this situation, in this sort of series. It's not unique, but it's not dead common. So yeah, I mean, that's how I see the twist on his character, where it's like Kenshin is the one who is fully embraced and accepted what he did and his responsibility for it, whereas in Ichigo's case, he didn't even really do anything wrong, and he's still living in trying to redeem himself for it.
I wanted to mention as well Rukia. We haven't gone into her yet.
Mm.
She's the other. She's the protagonist, the second character in the series, and she kind of is in a state of inaction just because of the setup of having Ichigo taking her powers. Um, but I do really enjoy their dynamic, and I think she's fun. And this idea of him being this like ignorant 15-year-old versus this spirit from another world who is over 100 years old. I think their difference in perspective is quite fun to see as well. She does bring up there's a little scene here which I really like. I think calls in nicely to what happens later on when you understand the full perspective. But she's watching this very personal confrontation between Grand Fisher and Ichigo, and she remembers being told she's considering what she should do to help and prevent the situation, and she remembers being told, "Is this a fight to preserve life or a fight to preserve honor?" And in seeing that this is about honor and Ichigo doing what he feels he needs to do for himself and for his family, she takes that step back and um, yeah, she recognizes that in the moment. I think that it's an interesting question that it poses, and it becomes more central to the narrative later on. Any thoughts on that? And then just I suppose Rukia, her dynamic with Ichigo, how she fits within the story. She's another very pivotal character to the Bleach identity.
Yeah, she's. I just actually featured her in a little short commission piece I did about the a so-called short commission piece about the most interesting short characters in anime and manga, because
Oh,
she's
good.
very short, and she's very short in the human form she takes. And the thing is that, as you said, she is over 100 years old, but she takes on a human form of a teenage girl, and I think she sort of enjoys this kind of like almost this, I would call it human cosplay that she's doing. And even though it's frequently interrupted with life and death situations, you can tell that she sort of likes it. She's having fun. Um, and again, another character who I wouldn't say, you know, blew me away. I don't feel like we get that many opportunities to really get inside of her mind that much, what she's thinking. But I do think I do think she has a nice contrast with Ichigo. I think they work pretty well together. I don't have any deep feelings for her either way, but in looking at the series, she's the sort of character I can imagine being quite popular with anime manga fans. So I imagine she probably has a pretty lofty place in fan preferences when it comes to characters in Bleach.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think maybe that I would say the main characters of Bleach are Ichigo, Rukia, and Orihime. And there is almost that triangle, that love interest, and who people shipped and what they wanted to see happen. And I think that also, for both sides of Rukia and Orihime, that kind of led into stronger feelings one way or another against them. So I, I'll go on record. I've never saw Ichigo and Rukia's relationship as romantic. They're very brother and sister to me. They're, but yeah, uh, I enjoy Ruki as well. And you're correct; she's very popular. Character maybe you do have more feelings about. Correct me if I'm wrong. Ichigo's dad, Isshin, he has is maybe one moment of sincerity at the grave with Ichigo, where you see there's more to this goofy exterior that he puts on around his daughters and Ichigo. Yeah, what do you make of Isshin?
I find him to be incredibly annoying, frankly. And I get that to a certain extent he's supposed to be annoying, but I think he's supposed to be annoying in a funny way, and I just find him annoying in an annoying way. And pretty much every time he comes on the page, I'm like, okay, how long until he's gone? He just grates on me in a really really kind of unidirectional way. There's really nothing about him I like as a character. I don't think he works for comedy. I don't think he brings anything to the story emotionally, because again, he's always got this mask of being this kind of not just kind of a goofball, but like a violent goofball in a sort of cartoon violence that isn't really funny in a series that ever tries to get you to take it seriously. Um, so yeah, he doesn't work for me. He doesn't work for me on any level. I'm not a fan, and that's the best, most honest answer I can give you.
Okay, fair enough. Not even in that moment of sincerity that he had,
I mean,
you
at
still not
that
won
point, it's
over.
like well, one over. I mean, it's better, but one or two pages doesn't make up for everything else that came before it. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, okay, we can
Mm.
see. I mean, on no level did I think this guy was like seriously as much of an idiot as he plays that all the time, because he couldn't be. No one is. But if he's going to adopt that persona all the time, I'm just not sure how much of a practical difference that makes, because that other side of him is all we ever really see. So, what difference does it make if he has this more sensitive, more reflective side, if he chooses never to show it? So,
Mm.
I mean, as a device, I mean, if he was my father, I would care that he showed that. That would be important to me, that he showed me that. Although I would like to think that I knew that about him anyway without it being shown. But as a reader, it doesn't really change things.
Okay. He is one of many characters that I think wear a mask on showing what they really feel and think about what's happening.
Yeah.
Ironic, given they're fighting these hollows, which have a mask and it covers up in a monstrous way what they're doing. I think that's a common thread across a lot of these characters. I also agree. The humor in Bleach is very, very hit or miss. There are instances here that I don't love. I mean, in general, I just don't love battle shonen comedy that much. Um, th- yeah, we talked about Lucius Samurai before. That is one that really doesn't resonate with me. I think One Piece generally has it quite good. If anything, the best one that we're seeing right now, which is
Hunter.
currently running, well, yeah, Hunter x Hunter is good. But I was going to say Ichi the Witch, where the humor is part of the
Yeah,
identity of the series, thanks to the writer. That's
right.
one where I think the balance is really, really good. But I've almost got to the point where I kind of just tune out these forced gags that so many of these series include. It's one part of Bleach where I'm like, I'm not going to sit here and defend that it's funny all the time, because it's not. There are other characters I think try to get that humor across, like, just to briefly touch on them, like Kon or Don Kanoji. I think the Kon segment, how he's introduced, is quite interesting, and he's this little mascot character from here on out. But I don't think he's as funny as Kubo wants him to be. And Don Kanoji, people find him quite amusing and strange. But that is probably my least favorite stretch of this arc as well. Um, Okay, let's segue over to the character you do like, who doesn't really have much of a sense of humor going on. That's Chad. He gets a little introduction with his little parakeet storyline as well. Yeah, take it away. Tell me about the character you do like.
Well, I was gonna say I liked actually Kon when he first was introduced. He made me laugh, and I thought that his backstory was really interesting. How he came into existence, I thought that it had some pathos to it. I kind of feel like he quickly degenerated into just sort of a throwaway comic relief character, which kind of disappointed me because I felt like there was something more there. But I really like Chad. I really like Chad. And Chad is kind of a stoic, he's a big, he's a big, powerful, kind of a scary, intimidating figure. But, and it's a bit of a cliche, the big, scary, brutal guy with the heart of gold and such. But, and he is in a certain sense, there is a bit of a stereotypical gentle giant there. But the thing I like about Chad actually is that he kind of is expectation defying, because it's not just he's this big gentle giant, and who's kind of simple but honest, and he's actually really smart and very thoughtful, and he just doesn't express it. He keeps it to himself. And I kind of, he's the one character in the cast that I've kind of find myself thinking, I would like to know more about this guy. How did he get to be the way he is? Why is he so unexpressive when he clearly has a very sensitive nature, and he's quite articulate when he does speak, and he's thinking articulate thoughts, but he doesn't share them. And I gather from the way things are going at the end of this first section that he's going to play a more significant role in the story going forward. And we have reasons to believe that, which I guess we'll talk about when we get to the spoiler side. But I really like him. I think he's, like I said, he's the one character. I mean, I like Ichigo. I never feel like I don't know everything I need to know about him. I don't feel like there are a lot of secrets there. I feel like we're kind of being told everything that's going on with him in his head. With Chad, I'm like, I want to know more about him. He's interesting, and it's like, so that's the one character in the cast that I feel that way about. So that's why I would say, among the side cast, he's probably my favorite.
Yeah, because I think it's touched on briefly, but his abuelo, his grandfather, that being like a source of his pride,
Yeah,
and where
briefly.
yeah, briefly. So yeah, that'll be a fun thing to explore
I
going into
like
the
the
next arc.
parakeet subplot too. I really like the parakeet subplot, which is basically,
It's
I'm
quite
allowed to
cute.
say, I think there. Yeah, there's a kid whose soul is in the body of a bird, and
Mm.
so and you know you can't, physically you're not going to get much more of an odd couple than a guy who looks like Chad and a parakeet. But I mean, the fact that Chad was the one who kind of took ownership of this, he showed the initiative to sort of take control of that situation. I think that's reflective of the sort of a person he is. And I really, yeah, I like that. I like that storyline, and I like him. I think he's really good.
We also see in that segment this introduction of hell as a concept as well. I don't have too much to say on it, but yeah, there's just things being sprinkled around, which I think is giving Kubo these seeds to pick up later on. I mentioned before in our last episode about the idea of like an architect or a gardener. Kubo is definitely a gardener. I'm not going to say that there are definitely elements of foreshadowing throughout the series, but I think a lot of it is him just being smart and planting seeds for things that he can utilize for various characters and like concepts and how they all tie back together. And a lot of them call back to this specific, all these different storylines in this arc. I would guess at the time he's kind of just jumping from all these different side quests, one after another. Yeah, so I think that's one thing I'll note for future record. Before I get to like the big moment that I think defines this arc, is I will say Ishida Uryu. He's Ichigo's rival, another one of the main cast. This introduction of the Quinces and the Menos Grandi, this hierarchy of the Hollows, and that's when Chad and Orihime unlock their powers as well. Funny enough, Uryu is a character that I've never enjoyed. I mean, I don't hate him, but he's never one who's resonated with me throughout the whole series. And even though he is Ichigo's rival, I don't know. There's just something about him which just doesn't do it for me. He's kind of
I
like
agree.
he's kind of the Sasuke, but I think Sasuke has a lot more to him. I think yeah, he's not bad, but some parts of him are
Yeah,
funny.
he doesn't do anything for me either. He's just kind of a he feels more like an archetype than a distinct individual to me.
Mhm.
And the whole Quincy thing, it from a plot standpoint, I have no idea where it's going in the future, and it may have a lot more to it. But at this point, the whole Quincy thing kind of plays as sort of extraneous and tacked on. I don't, and I kind of feel like I know where he's going with it, but I feel like, okay, I have a sense there could be more to this that takes it to another level as we progress. But right now, it just doesn't do that much for me, the whole Quincy thing.
Yeah, I won't say much more in specifics, but it is touched on here, I believe, that this idea of Quincy's offsetting the balance. The reason why the Soul
Right,
Reapers do their job, the Shinigami do their job and exist, is because they need to maintain the amount of souls in each of these different realms. And the Quincy's have this, they're like a destructive force in the middle of it.
right.
We don't understand really the full context, other than there was this great war that happened where the Shinigamis essentially like committed genocide against the Quincies because their very existence threatens the balance of the worlds. So yeah, at this point in the story, Uryu being the vehicle for the Quincies, I think he's probably my least favorite of the main cast in that way. I'll wrap up. We'll get to the end of the story arc. This is where things really kick off. I believe, from what I understand, like Bleach was kind of popular at this point in the magazine. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't like the third place that it eventually becomes for like 6 or 7 years in the table of contents and volume sales. But I think it was probably mid ranking in the table of contents back then, from what I've saw. And I think editors maybe pushed Kubo to be like, okay, let's get to like what's being built up here, which is this idea of Rukia, the Soul Society. Um, After all these side quests, introducing all these concepts and characters, we get the introduction of Byakuya and Renji, who arrive to the human world to retrieve Rukia. As we find out, she actually broke the law by giving Ichigo her powers and for making him a substitute Shinigami. Um, we get some introduction of things like the Zanpakuto, this power system, which isn't fully explored here yet. So I'll leave that for another episode. But yeah, these are Rukia, Rukia and Renji and Byakuya. These are characters that from here on out, I think another one of Bleach's strength is the cast of characters, and I probably wouldn't go against the grain by saying that the Soul Society, and the Shinigami, those are the people. That is the identity of the series that people latch onto. So seeing that come to the forefront at the very end of this arc, I will say for me, one of the definitive moments in my anime manga experience is when Byakuya breaks Ichigo's sword. When it's just he's so fast that you can't see him. The anime does it very, very well. As a 14-year-old, I saw that I was like, "Oh my god, Byakuya's like the coolest guy ever. I love him." Um, yeah, there's more hints that there's something brewing. This relationship that Rukia has with her brother Byakuya, how Renji ties into this as well. Yeah, I love this entire sequence. This for me is like when Bleach becomes Bleach. So I was wondering, did you feel when that was happening, you were like, oh, it's starting now. The story has shifted from A to B.
Well, I kind of feel like when Renji showed up, it was a very like pregnant with significance moment. You could tell, okay, he's going to be important. you know, there is a sense of sort of a prologue over. I find this like to just compare and contrast the series we've been talking about. I find the sword stuff specifically to be more compelling in Kenshin because it is grounded in a real world setting. So when I see something amazing with the swords in Kenshin, that probably hits me a little harder than it does in a series where we're talking about, literal superhuman. I mean, some of the stuff in Kenshin is not 100% realistic that a person could do it. I realize that, but it's still in the context of real world situations. So I don't have that quite that same sense of awe in that moment that you do, but I certainly feel like that whole sequence of moments, yes, you can tell this is like, okay, now we're going into the deep end of the pool. Now the real story is getting started. And like I said, when Renji showed up, I was like, okay, this is an important character. He's going to play a big part in the story going forward. There's no question about it.
As we find then, Rukia is taken back to Soul Society. She does have that quite strong moment with Ichigo where she tells him not to follow her. I love that as well. One of my favorites from her. As the arc wraps up, you find out that she's going to be put up for execution, which is kind of being pushed as well by her brother Byakuya, who seems to not be affected by this. So yeah, there's rumblings of things happening. This is all setting up to the Soul Society arc, which I think is the equivalent to like the Kyoto arc for Rurouni Kenshin. So it's going to be very interesting for us to do both of them at the same time. I have mentioned Soul Society is that was the other arc where when we were talking about Chimera Ant, that's if I was to measure best versus personal favorite, I would split the two in that way. So
Mm.
yeah, I'm very excited for that. And then I should touch on Urahara as well. He's Ichigo's like mentor, training figure, and he helps Rukia. There's he's a funny guy. He's got I think it's fair to say it seems like there's more to him than meets the eye from what you see, and uh, he has a fun dynamic with Ichigo, and even from this early portion of the story, I think fans gravitated towards him, and yeah, I was wondering if you had any just like final thoughts on this whole
Well,
section.
he's like if you were like casting the I don't know if there's ever been a live action version of Bleach.
Yeah, there has.
Um, but it's like you have certain roles in stories where you think, okay, this is the one that the actor is really going to want to play. And I feel like with Bleach that he's the role that like an actor would really want to play because he gets a lot of like big kind of headline moments, and he gets to be funny, he gets to be suave, he gets to be badass. So yeah, he's the character that like if you're one of those character actors, you're like, yeah, this is the guy I want to play. Which I think is reflected in the role he plays in the story. He has an interesting, like, he has a weird kind of a motley crew of people who work for him at his shop, like a couple of little kids who I think we can assume are actually probably, quite old and just look like little kids. This weird mustachioed guy who's always, half naked. And, and then there's the black cat too, whose name it doesn't spring to mind to me at the moment.
Yoroichi.
Yeah, who's not directly connected, I guess, with Urahara, but obviously like indirectly connected with him. So that whole group is kind of interesting and fun and weird in a quirky way, and he's definitely a part of that. We're going to you're going to see a mentor character show up in Kenshin at some point. I don't think that surprises you. And he's very, very different in a like a comically different way. So yeah, I think he's interesting. I think he's very much again, he's a shonen archetype, but he's entertaining in his own right. And even though they're both archetypes, I find him more effective as a narrative device, as a character, than Uryu is personally. I think he's more realized as a character. So I would say yes, he scores higher for me.
Okay. With this final section of Ichigo and Urahara, we're setting up all the pieces for what is going to go from here, from the story onwards, all these concepts and characters we've introduced. And the arc ends with Ichigo, Orihime, Chad, and Uryu going to Soul Society with Yorichi the Black Cat to save Rukia. And that is the setup for what's going to come next. We discussed this on the previous episode, so let's do it here as well, about what currently running Jump or a Jump adjacent magazine, like what series that's not by Tite Kubo do you think do you see as like a direct descendant of Bleach? I will answer first because it's a funny answer. It's a funny answer because you mentioned it already, and I don't mean it as a compliment necessarily because I don't enjoy this series, but I feel like News Exorcist is actually one that I think takes a lot of inspiration from Bleach, but as someone who loves Bleach, it feels very surface level, and there are moments that happen. Like there is a moment which feels the exact same as Rukia telling Ichigo, "Don't come after me," but like having the pain and regret of not wanting to have to say that, saying it to protect Ichigo. Does it seem very much like that? I think the main character kind of evolves in the same way, Gakuro to Ichigo, and yeah, Bleach has the power of cool on its side, but I think why it has a balance as well of this idea of the heart these characters have and like what they're hiding from each other and from themselves, that there is more depth to their actions. And I don't know if I see that in News Exorcist. It feels quite surface level to me. So yeah, that's my kind of like shady answer to what series is like a descendant of Bleach.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm curious if you feel there's any other on your side.
Well, I only read a couple chapters of that one before I dropped it, so I can't really say to what extent it may or may not be a direct descendant of Bleach. It didn't strike me immediately, but then at the time I'd read those chapters, I hadn't looked at Bleach in probably 10 years. So there is a series that's, I guess, when I asked this question, I said, okay, Jump Square, or Jump Plus. There is actually another, I guess it's a Jump series that's sort of in its own category. You know the one I mean? It's sort of like it's the only one in its category, but it's a big seller that I think some people could argue Black Clover has a bit of Bleach in it.
Oh yeah.
Although it's not the one I ultimately picked, but I can sort of see a link, and I guess Black Clover has a sort of a unique Jump Giga. It's sort of in its unique category at the moment. And a non-Jump series, which I think definitely has a lot of Bleach in it, is Gachiakuda, for the record. I definitely see a connection there. But you can comment on that.
Just on the side of that, I may mention this more next time we do Soul Society, because I feel like even though it's very briefly touched upon here, the idea of Zanpakuto as the power system, I feel like that is very similar to the power system in Gachiakuta as well. Bringing out the strength of something in that way. So yes, I agree with that.
But the Jump series, because that was the rules I set up, I'm going to pick is Aono Exorcist, Blue Exorcist, which has it has a similar kind of a cheeky irreverence to it, and I think one of the things that stood out to me about the first arc of Bleach is that it does have a kind of a cheeky irreverence to it as compared to some other big jump battle shonen. And I think I see some of that in Blue Exorcist. I see some of the relationships, not so much particular characters having direct counterparts in the other series, but some of the relationships between the characters in Blue Exorcist remind me of the relationships between characters in Bleach. And I would also say the mythology is somewhat similar too, I think. There are some kind of roughly similar concepts and in the different worlds and you know, Aono Exorcist does not have I would say a neatly defined power system, but it does have some similarities in the overall mythology and the rules, I would say. So that's my pick, I would say, is Aono Exorcist.
Yeah, I can see that a lot actually. I can see Rin and Ichigo, maybe like Shiemi and Orihime as well. Are you going to use that as your recommendation then? You gave
No,
quite a
it's not.
detailed.
It's not my recommendation.
Okay, fair enough. That was quite a detailed answer nonetheless. Fine. Let's jump on to recommendations. And I think we're both going to do jump titles for this as well. So, which makes sense. I'm going to do Yu Yu Hakusho as my recommendation for Bleach, this first arc specifically, by Yoshihiro Togashi, of course. And I'm talking about the first arc there as well, so the Spirit Detective arc. It came a decade before Bleach, and it just has very, very similar structure. Yusuke and Ichigo. Ichigo's not quite like a delinquent or as abrasive as Yusuke is, but he's kind of like a hard-headed, comes off as an aggressive teenage boy. And then you have this dynamic with Rukia and Botan, these spirits from the other world, who are tasked with taking people to the afterlife. I just think there is those arcs as well have kind of built up of all these different sub stories, these hijinks, and then they like segue into the Dark Tournament arc and the Soul Society arc, which are the most definitive of the respective series. So I just think in terms of structure and like character dynamics, there's some very, very obvious influence I feel in Yu Yu Hakusho, even though I don't know if I've ever actually saw it being confirmed by interview or anything. Yeah, it's one I've always felt from Bleach.
Well, my pick is kind of a left field pick in that the superficially the two series are so different. But I'm going with it. Many of our readers will not have heard of this. It's a pretty obscure series. It's called Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba. I find similarity and recommendation are not necessarily the same thing. But our official category is recommendations for something similar. So I guess I have to justify the similarity as well as the recommendation. But I feel that Ichigo's personal journey puts me in mind of Tanjiro. Now, Tanjiro is a more, you know, personality wise, he's much more polite. He's much more earnest. But a lot of that happy face thing with Tanjiro is masking his own guilt. I think, let me put it this way. Ichigo and Tanjiro are both characters who are living, breathing examples of survivor's guilt. I don't think there's any question about that. Again, should Tanjiro blame himself for what happened to his family? No, of course not. But he does. And so I think a lot of what he does is to try to make up in his own mind for his role in what happened, or role or lack of role in what happened to his family. And I also feel like when I look at some of the hollows in Bleach, which we, especially when we get a little bit of backstory with them, which we do in a couple of these little mini arcs in the first section, I'm reminded a little bit of some of the demons in Kimetsu. Actually, it puts me in mind of that. So I can't point a direct line to Gachi like with Gachi or Ano Exorcist, I can point to more kind of direct descendancy and more direct similarities, but there's something in the existential level that, as stylistically different as they are and as temperamentally different as the main characters are, I feel a certain connection with Kimetsu here. So that's my pick, Demon Slayer. It sold a few copies. It did okay for itself.
Interesting, because that I think that comparison will come up next arc as well. I think there is something that Gotougehi has taken direct inspiration from Bleach and an element of Demon Slayer. So yes, very good. Let's go to our wrap up and then final ratings. Enzo, I'll let you go first. Final thoughts on this arc, going into Soul Society arc, and then also what's your score out of 100?
I like it. I don't read these 70 chapters. I don't read them, and it doesn't immediately strike me that there's anything exceptional about them, to be honest. Like I said, the most kind of striking thing is this it was actually during the course of our conversation when I was looking at those pages and thinking about that black and white thing. That kind of struck me. That is genuinely really interesting. That's something really distinctive. And I think it does a lot of things, quite well, and it checks a lot of boxes. I don't feel a great sense of breaking new ground or and it's possible too that at this point, Bleach is 20 years old roughly now, since it started. There are things I've seen in other series that probably owe their existence to Bleach, that are strongly influenced to it, to a greater extent than I realize at this point. And so there's probably things that would feel more groundbreaking and more influential about Bleach if I was reading it 20 years ago than reading it now. But it feels to me more like just a good, solid battle shonen with some interesting, quirky elements, a nice kind of an irreverent style, which I like. And and you mentioned the poems. I like the poems. I think the poems. I don't think the poems are, I don't think they're like Wordsworth or anything, but I think they're interesting, and I think that they reflect more than even in as much as the poems themselves. I think they reflect a kind of an interesting outlook that the author takes toward the series, and I do think I like the aura they bring, and some of the poems are quite good. I agree. So I like it. I don't love it. I mean, my score is going to be 70 out of 100 for this arc, which I was probably, when I recommend a series to you, I often find that when you give your score, you say, well, for a while I was higher, but then, the last couple, so you always tend to go down by the end of whatever it is I've recommended to you. Whereas with Bleach, I was probably in the 60s through most of it. And the last several chapters with the training arc, and then oddly enough, the summer vacation arc, which was kind of like the calm before the storm, only 1 or 2 chapters, but I really liked that. It was kind of an offbeat, kind of a self-reflection that I liked. That was as reflective as we've seen Ichigo, is that little summer vacation bit right before the end of this arc. So, I'm going to give it a 70 out of 100, which is, and you're talking about those other series, like I said, that I kind of like more than love, that it puts me in mind of. I'm kind of in that same general ballpark here.
Similar to how you felt about me and my rating for Tokyo Arc and Rurouni Kenshin, I think I'm that's kind of what I expected. I'm not too shocked or disappointed. My feelings on this arc, it is the weakest arc of the series for me. Spoiler, there are 5 arcs in Bleach, but if we're going to go over each of them, some of them are quite long, so we might have to split them up. Yeah, it is the weakest, I think, by a pretty decent margin. And I think a lot of that comes down to Kubo finding his identity as an author, just setting up these pieces, finding his style. And yeah, like you say, I think in this final stretch, that's where you can feel the rhythm come into play of what maybe is the direction it's going to go. So I shall be curious to see if your score reflects that as what I consider to be some of the best material in the series coming up. Similar to me going to be reading the Kyoto arc. I'm going to give it, in the end, an 88. That's what I'm giving it.
Okay.
But my 88, so much of that is down to this. Is just I cannot separate the nostalgia of what Bleach is.
I was going to say.
So yeah,
I think the later material is bleeding into that score a little bit because you can't unknow what you know. And I know how strongly you feel about the next arc because 88 for that is that's an affectionate score. That's
it's
an
an affectionate score, but then again, I love these characters. I love the series, so I will hold my hand up. I cannot separate that from it. Yes, it's going to be interesting these next 2 episodes for both of our series, I feel. Great. I think that about wraps it up then. Thank you, Enzo, for finally tackling 1/3 of the big 3 for now. We could do this with One Piece. We could do like 30 episodes on all the arcs. What do you think of that?
No.
Okay, rejected.
If you're gonna subsidize my retirement, I'm happy to do it in my downtime. As long as I have to keep working for a living, that ain't gonna happen.
Very valid. Great. Right. Thanks for the discussion, Enzo. Yes, and
Thank
then
you.
stick around for next time, everyone. And we're going to be continuing to go through both these series, similar to how we do with Hunter x Hunter. So, as Enzo says, stay frosty. Bye bye.